I'm Clara Bennett, 35 years old, 127 days unemployed, scraping by on ramen and half-expired grocery clearance bins in downtown Chicago's grimy studio district. A January wind off Lake Michigan cuts through thin, thrifted blazers like a blade, and I've camped out in a hole-in-the-wall noodle shop for 2 full hours, staring at a single plain noodle bowl I ordered just to claim a table. The shop owner's side-eye glares burn into my spine every 60 seconds, but I can't bring myself to stand up and leave. My phone screen glows with a pending confirmation button for a final round interview, and I've tapped the button and backed away 30 separate times in the last hour. The company up for my application is Summit Media Group, a $2,200 billion media and tech conglomerate dominating every vertical from streaming content to venture capital. Its founder and sole CEO is Elias Hale, 34, featured nonstop on every business magazine front cover, hailed as the sharpest strategic mind of our generation. Elias Hale, the boy I sat next to for 4 full college years, the man I quietly bankrolled through his entire undergraduate career, the person I spent 12 straight years forcing myself to erase from every corner of my life. I glance at my blurry reflection in the shop's smudged glass window. Crowded out fine lines crinkle the corners of my eyes no drugstore concealer can fully mask, my skin's dull, my under eye bruising deep from months of sleepless resume spamming nights. At 35, I carry no spouse, no prestigious corporate tenure on my CV, the only notable bullet point 3 years of junior graphic design work at a tiny local boutique agency that folded without severance last autumn. My landlord's 5th overdue rent reminder text pops up mid-stare, and I squeeze my eyes shut tight. Logically, there's zero chance he'd remember my face after over a decade apart. Elias moves in circles filled with elite executives, supermodel socialites, and industry titans. A forgotten college desk mate from 12 years prior wouldn't register as more than a passing stranger to him. But I need this senior brand creative director role desperately. My savings sit at just $2,800, barely enough to cover 1 more month's rent, and minimal groceries. I tap the confirmation button without overthinking it, the screen flashing a formal reminder to report to the 42nd floor of Summit Media HQ at 9 a.m. Monday morning for the executive final interview, to be conducted personally by CEO Elias Hale. The second I lock my phone screen, every buried memory surges unbidden, a tidal wave of suppressed feeling I'd buried deep for 12 long years, starting back in the fall of 2013 at Westbrook State University. I first crossed paths with Elias in the cramped stairwell of the campus admin building 3 weeks into freshman orientation. I clutched an armful of enrollment paperwork, rushing downstairs to submit a late transcript form when 2 loud, rowdy upperclassmen barreled around the bend, their swinging elbows slamming directly into my stack of papers. Every single sheet scattered across the cold concrete stairs, and my footing slipped forward, teetering toward a hard metal handrail with zero grip to steady myself. A pair of solid, steady arms wrapped around my upper torso from behind, locking my weight back onto stable ground before I crashed down the flight of steps. I spun around to thank my savior, and locked eyes with a lanky, sharp-featured kid in a faded gray long-sleeve tee with stretched-out collar fabric, a thin pale scar cutting across the back of his left hand. He didn't offer a single smile, just bent to gather every stray sheet of paper, stacking them perfectly neat before pressing the pile into my palms. His voice was low, flat, stripped of any warmth. "Watch your footing next time." Before I could stammer out a word of gratitude, he turned and climbed the stairs with a heavy hardcover economics textbook tucked under one arm, vanishing into the crowded hallway without a second glance. That brief interaction stuck with me hard. I'd memorized his worn gray shirt and that faint hand scar, even without knowing his full name yet. I rambled the whole story to my dorm roommate Mia that night, and she immediately teased me for developing a crush on a mystery stranger I couldn't even identify by name. I denied it fiercely back then, but the image of his steady, unflinching grip lingered in my head nonstop for weeks. 2 weeks later, our marketing department professor rearranged every lecture seating chart mid-semester, calling out names one by one to reassigned desk partners. When Professor Carter said, "Clara Bennett, you're paired with Elias Hale," my blood ran cold. I grabbed my canvas backpack and shuffled to the window-side desk, and there he sat, same faded gray tee, that distinct pale scar across his knuckles, had bowed as he scribbled dense, tiny handwriting across his textbook margins. He lifted his gaze for half a second when I pulled out the empty chair beside him, uttered one single syllable of acknowledgement, "Ham," and returned his note-taking without further small talk. For the first month as desk partners, Elias barely exchanged 10 total sentences with me. He arrived to lecture 30 minutes early every single morning, never lingered in the cafeteria after class, skipped every campus mixer, club recruitment fair, and student group hangout entirely. I watched his daily routine unravel piece by piece, a quiet hardship he never vocalized to anyone in our cohort. Every lunch hour, he pulled 2 dry white bread slices out of his backpack and chewed them slowly with plain tap water, no deli meat, no fruit, no granola bar to fill the gap. He bolted out of the lecture hall the instant the final bell rang each afternoon, vanishing off campus with no explanation of where he headed after class. My other roommate Lila whispered campus gossip one night that Elias had repeated 2 full years of high school to scrape together his tuition deposit, his family's finances stretched impossibly thin with no parental financial support to fall back on. I never voiced my observations out loud to anyone, but each time I watched him pick at those sad dry bread slices, a sharp, aching twist pulled tight in my chest. I knew what crushing poverty felt like firsthand. My single mom ran a tiny rural convenience store to fund my tuition, forcing me to wear hand-me-down winter coats through grade school while other kids sported brand-name outerwear. I understood the quiet shame of going hungry to avoid drawing unwanted attention from peers, the silent pride that stopped people from begging for help even when they were barely scraping by to survive. A month after our seating swap, a wealthy, effortlessly popular classmate named Kaylee Voss set her sights firmly on Elias and immediately targeted me as a roadblock standing between her and her crush. Kaylee's family owned a regional construction conglomerate. She rotated designer leather handbags weekly, cycled through luxury lipstick shades with every new season, and had built an extensive campus social network within weeks of starting college. One afternoon after lecture wrapped, I summoned the courage to tap Elias's shoulder and ask for clarification on a confusing advertising psychology concept from our textbook. He paused packing his bag, grabbed my pen, and scrawled a concise, crystal-clear breakdown of the core logic in the margin of my notebook before nodding once and walking out the door. Seconds after he left, Kaylee dragged a spare lecture chair over to my desk, crossing her legs and fixing me with a sharp, unamused stare, her diamond stud earring glinting under the classroom fluorescent lights. A pair of her equally entitled friends lingered a few feet back, listening in on our exchange. "You're getting far too cozy with Elias for someone who's nowhere near his league," she said flat, no polite preamble to soften the jab. I tried explaining I'd only asked a simple academic question, but Kaylee cut me off instantly, sneering that any confusing textbook passage could be resolved via Google or our professor, no need to seek out Elias specifically. She stood and sauntered away, tossing a final warning over her shoulder not to initiate another conversation with him again. The moment she exited the room, my roommate Mia stepped out from the hallway doorway, having witnessed the entire confrontation. She ranted about Kaylee's spoiled, entitled attitude all the walk back to our dorm. Furious, Kaylee thought she could dictate who I spoke to in class. I brushed Mia's anger off outwardly, but Kaylee's offhand comment burrowed deep into my insecurities, looping through my head every night before sleep. Not his league. A cold, self-loathing certainty settled over me that Elias existed on a plane entirely separate from my own, his quiet intelligence and relentless drive putting him miles out of my reach, and I had no business inserting myself into his orbit at all. After Kaylee's confrontation, I forced myself to maintain deliberate distance from Elias in class, staring straight forward during lectures and never opening my mouth to ask him anything again. Yet every tiny detail of his struggle still seeped into my awareness, impossible to tune out no matter how hard I tried to avoid watching him. I tracked his lunch routine, noticed he never purchased bottled drinks from campus vending machines, only refilled a beat-up plastic water bottle from bathroom faucets, clocked his consistent 4:30 afternoon exit time every weekday without fail. I had zero clue where he rushed off to each afternoon, until a rainy mid-November Friday cracked the mystery wide open, triggering the first major plot twist that rewrote how I saw every silent sacrifice he endured. Class let out 2 hours early that day due to a professor's medical appointment, and I got trapped under a torrential downpour outside the campus main gate with no umbrella on hand. While waiting under a supermarket awning for the storm to calm, I spotted Elias's beat-up, rusted second-hand bicycle cutting through the pouring rain, no rain jacket or hood to shield his frame, mud splattering all over his denim pant cuffs as he pedaled down the side street. A reckless, unplanned impulse took hold of me. I hailed a shared ride service and told the driver to follow his bike at a slow, discreet distance, curious where he vanished to every single weekday evening. 15 minutes of trailing his route led us to a narrow, run-down old downtown alley lined with cheap diners and second-hand shops. He locked his bike to a rusted metal rack behind a hole-in-the-wall family restaurant and slipped through the back service entrance, pulling a grease-stained canvas apron over his tee and vanishing into the steamy kitchen window to wash stacks of dinner dishes for minimum wage until 10 p. M. I stood alone across the street under a leaking store awning for hours, watching his hunched, exhausted silhouette scrub endless piles of ceramic plates through fogged glass, rain still dripping down my neck and soaking through my thin hoodie the entire time. When he finally clocked out and climbed back onto his bike long after dark, his frame gaunt and drained from 5 straight hours of manual labor, I remained rooted to the sidewalk, frozen with a crushing sadness I couldn't name. That night, I made a quiet, unspoken promise to myself to find a subtle, undetectable way to ease his financial burden without wounding his fierce, unyielding pride. A week after I watched Elias scrub dishes until midnight in that grease-streaked diner kitchen, I stumbled on the second crack in his fragile finances, another twist that solidified my quiet plan to help him without ever being caught. I tagged along to the weekend campus flea market with Mia, hunting cheap used design textbooks for my elective illustration course, when a stack of hardcover marketing reference books caught my eye at a random vendor's table. I flipped open the top volume, and a faded ink signature scrawled across the front fly made my chest lock tight. Elias Hale, Fall 2013. The shopkeeper told me the kid who'd sold the whole stack had shown up alone the weekend prior, desperate for quick pocket change, haggling down every price just to walk away with a handful of cash. I bought every single textbook he traded away for $100 total, even though half the advanced business content was far outside my coursework load. I hauled the heavy stack back to my dorm through another light drizzle, tucking the books deep under my bed's locked storage bin so Elias would never spot them if he ever stopped by our room. Staring at his neat, tiny handwriting late that night, I realized just how desperate he truly was. Those textbooks were his most valuable study tools, the foundation of all his top-tier exam scores, and he parted with them for barely $30 a set just to cover grocery and bus fare. 2 weekends later, I returned to that same flea market early in the morning and spotted Elias camped out in the furthest, least trafficked corner of the alley. He'd laid a frayed old bedsheet flat on the concrete, spreading out his remaining textbooks and a couple well-worn hoodies to sell. Hardly any passers-by paused to browse his wares, and he stood stiff, shoulders hunched against the cold wind, waiting for hours without a single customer. An older male vendor finally wandered over to bargain on the whole pile, offering a measly $30 for every book he'd laid out. I watched Elias stare at the stack for a full 10 seconds, jaw tight with reluctant surrender, before nodding and handing the books over to pocket that tiny wad of bills. I waited until the man walked off with Elias's textbooks, then crossed the alley to buy the entire stack back from the reseller for triple what he'd paid, carrying the heavy bundle back hidden inside my oversized winter parka so Elias wouldn't spot me. By the time I got home to my dorm, my shoes and coat were soaked through, but I didn't care. All I could think about was the quiet deceit etched across his face when he'd handed over his study materials for spare change. That night, the idea of secretly loading money onto his student meal card fully crystallized in my head. I knew he'd never accept direct cash, gift cards, or any outright charity, so anonymous cafeteria top-ups were the only way to feed him without triggering his defensive pride. The first chance to act arrived a few days later, midweek lecture break. Elias ducked out to the admin office to submit a financial aid form, leaving his student ID card resting face up beneath his textbook on our shared desk. The classroom was nearly empty, only 2 other students scrolling phones in the back rows, so I slipped the blue plastic card into the inner pocket of my hoodie, heart hammering so loud I swore the people nearby could hear it. I rushed straight to the campus cafeteria self-service recharge kiosk, queuing up with sweaty, trembling palms and typing in a $300 deposit, the full 2 months tutoring income I'd set aside to buy my mom a new winter coat for Christmas. The machine pinged a bright, deposit successful chime, and I stared at the updated balance on the screen for a long beat, lightheaded from the weight of what I'd just done. I hurried back to the lecture hall and slid his card exactly where he'd left it before he returned, pretending to focus on my notebook like nothing had happened the whole time I waited for him to walk through the door. When Elias came back to his seat minutes later, he grabbed his card, glanced down at the balance readout on the chip scanner built into his wallet, and froze for roughly 2 full seconds. He didn't turn to question me, didn't comment out loud, just tucked the card away and resumed copying lecture notes as if nothing odd had occurred, but I caught the split-second flicker of confusion cross his features, and my stomach twisted into a tight, nervous knot for the rest of class. The next day at lunch, I lingered by the cafeteria's back pillar to watch from a distance. For the first time all semester, Elias didn't grab 2 dry bread slices from his bag. He headed straight to the hot entree counter and ordered a full tomato beef pasta plate, a meal he'd never been able to afford before the deposit hit his card. He sat alone at a far table, chewing each slow bite carefully, and a soft, quiet warmth bloomed in my chest as I watched him eat a proper, filling meal for once. That evening, I stopped by the campus dollar stationery shop and bought a pale blue line journal, its cover worn and soft at the edges. On the first blank page, I jotted down every small detail of that day's secret deposit, documenting the quiet joy I'd felt seeing him eat well for the first time. That journal would become my private archive of every hidden gesture I made for Elias over the next 4 years. No one else would ever read a single line inside it. I understood his pride better than anyone else on campus, having grown up watching my mom hide her own financial struggles behind a brave, uncomplaining mask to keep me from worrying about our tight household budget. I knew Elias would never openly accept handouts, so I built a routine of subtle, untraceable care that he couldn't refuse without embarrassment. When winter rolled around and the campus heating cut out overnight, I slipped disposable hand warmers into his desk drawer before early morning lecture, telling him the campus student union had handed out free packs to everyone when he asked where they'd come from. During midterm exam weeks, I stashed chocolate protein bars in the side pocket of his backpack, claiming I grabbed too many on a grocery sale and couldn't finish them all myself. When he came down with a brutal head cold that left him sniffling through 3 straight lectures, I left a box of decongestant tea bags beside his water bottle, lying that my roommate had purchased the wrong brand and didn't want them wasting away in our dorm cabinet. Every time he muttered a quiet thanks my way, my face burned hot enough to match the classroom radiators, and I'd rush to brush off his gratitude with clumsy, rushed excuses to avoid exposing the truth. I narrowly escaped being caught twice, both moment-sharp, heart-stopping scares that forced me to refine my secret routine even further. The first close call hit mid-sophomore year. I just swiped his meal card from his desk to sneak another $500 deposit when Elias doubled back to the lecture hall for a forgotten set of class keys, without warning. I'd only managed to slide the card under my textbook 2 seconds before he pushed through the doorway, and I held my breath the entire time he grabbed his keys and left again, certain he'd spotted the card tucked under my notebook and put the pieces together instantly. He shot me a quick, searching glance on his way out, and my hands shook so badly I couldn't hold a pen steady for the rest of the period. The second near exposure happened junior year, a far more alarming close call. Elias stared at his student card for a full minute after lunch one day, twisting the plastic back and forth in his fingers with a furrowed, confused brow. "My balance never lines up with how much I actually spend," he said out loud, glancing sideways at me without outright accusation. "I track every purchase down to the dollar, but there's always extra money appearing out of nowhere. Do you think the campus payment system's glitching?" I forced a casual, unbothered shrug to mask my internal panic, rambling a quick lie about the university upgrading their kiosk software that semester and widespread calculation errors affecting hundreds of student accounts. He considered my explanation for a long moment before nodding and dropping the subject, but I could tell he didn't fully buy my excuse, just chose not to press the matter further out of quiet consideration for whatever hidden reason lay behind the mysterious extra funds appearing on his card. Kaylee never stopped inserting herself into Elias's orbit over those 3 years, shifting her tactics from open intimidation to subtle, passive-aggressive jabs designed to chip away at my fragile self-confidence. At group dinner outings with our marketing cohort, she'd loudly comment on my thrifted, repeated outfits for the whole table to hear, mocking how little disposable income one had to spend on new clothes. Before morning lectures, she gossiped to her group of friends just loud enough for me to overhear, pitying students forced to work minimum wage tutoring gigs just to cover tuition costs. I never argued back or confronted her directly, letting her cutting remarks slide off my surface, but every night lying awake in my dorm bed, those words looped endlessly through my brain, amplifying the deep insecurity I already carried about not belonging in Elias's world. I knew Kaylee had wealth, social clout, family connections, and unapologetic confidence on her side, all the things I'd never possess, yet I still couldn't bring myself to stop quietly supporting Elias's day-to-day survival, no matter how inferior Kay's comments made me feel. A massive turning point arrived that December. The statewide collegiate brand strategy competition hosted at our university's auditorium, an event that revealed Elias's quiet, unshakable ambition and locked my unspoken love for him fully into place. Every department submitted a 4-person team to compete for a $15,000 research grant, and our marketing program squad was short one member, so our advisor begged Elias to fill the empty spot despite his reluctance to take time away from his 2 part-time jobs. He hesitated for days before finally agreeing to join the team, only out of desperate need of the grant money to cover the next semester's tuition bills. I sat alone in the 5th auditorium row to watch the presentations, my hands clenched tight in my lap the entire time Elias's team waited their turn to speak. The business school's rival squad delivered a flashy, polished presentation loaded with glossy data charts and fully scripted English dialogue, earning constant nods of approval from every judge seated at the front table. When our team's 3 junior members finished walking through their basic market research slides, they stepped aside and handed the final 8 minutes of speaking time entirely to Elias. He stepped up to the presentation podium without notes or cue cards, no fancy visual aids to prop up his argument, and immediately dismantled the rival team's core foundational assumption with calm, unshakable clarity. The competing strategy operates under one flawed core belief. This domestic athletic brand needs to chase overseas competitors' luxury branding to succeed, Elias said, his voice steady and unraised, cutting through the auditorium's quiet hum. That logic ignores our country's 14 billion person domestic consumer base, the largest athletic goods market on the planet. This brand doesn't need to catch up to foreign labels. It needs to earn unwavering trust from its own home audience first. He broke down 3 fully actionable, data-backed brand restructuring plans without a single filler phrase, every point sharp and rooted in real consumer survey data our team had collected over months of volunteer research. No performative stage gestures, no emotional appeals, just unvarnished, authentic belief in the strategy he built from scratch. When he finished his 8-minute talk and bowed his head, the auditorium sat silent for 3 full beats before erupting into thunderous applause that echoed off the ceiling rafters. The business school students seated directly in front of me muttered defeat to one another, fully aware their flashy presentation had been completely outmatched by Elias's grounded, logical perspective. I clapped until my palms stung raw, my heart racing so fast I could barely breathe. When the crowd swarmed Elias post-presentation to congratulate him, he slipped away from the throng within a minute, grabbing his beat-up backpack and walking alone toward the exit doors without lingering to socialize. I watched his thin, hunched-back recede into the hallway, still wearing that faded gray long-sleeve tee he'd owned since freshman year, and realized my fondness for him had bloomed into something far heavier than casual schoolgirl admiration. I didn't love him just for his sharp good looks or quiet reserve. I loved the way he endured crushing financial hardship without complaining once, the quiet integrity he carried through every struggle, the unshakable belief he held in his own ideas even when the world offered him zero support or resources to execute them. That night back in my dorm, my roommates teased me relentlessly for the obvious blush staining my cheeks, and I buried my face in my pillow rather than deny what they'd already clearly figured out. A small, telling side incident unfolded right after the competition ended that evening. Kaylee intercepted Elias on the auditorium's front sidewalk, clutching an expensive imported mineral water bottle tied with a satin gift ribbon as a congratulatory offering for his winning presentation. Elias glanced at the fancy bottle once, shook his head, and walked straight past her without a single extra word, rejecting her lavish gesture outright. Kaylee stood frozen on the sidewalk holding the unopened drink, her carefully constructed cheerful smile crumbling away for just a split second before she composed herself again and stormed off with her friends. As she passed me on her way to the parking lot, her eyes flicked over mine in a bitter, resentful glare. She knew I'd watched the entire exchange, and seethed over the fact Elias had turned down her thoughtful gift without hesitation, yet never questioned the endless anonymous funds appearing on his student meal card week after week. That moment hammered home the stark divide between Kaylee's loud, performative attempts to win Elias's attention and my quiet, invisible acts of care that he'd never once traced back to me. Senior spring hit Westbrook State fast, cherry blossom petals blowing across campus walkways, and the first big shift in our separate futures landed on the department bulletin board, graduate school acceptance postings taped to corkboard. Elias's name sat printed at the very top of the Elite East Coast Finance Master's program roster, full tuition stipend included. The lecture hall erupted around me as classmates crowded the wall to cheer him on, clapping his shoulders and shouting invites to celebratory dinners that night. He offered a thin, fleeting smile, one of the rare relaxed expressions I'd ever seen cross his face, before slipping away from the mob as soon as the noise died down. I lingered at the back of the crowd, staring at his printed name while a bitter, dual wave of emotion crashed over me all at once. On one hand, pure, unfiltered joy. Every late night he'd spent scrubbing restaurant dishes, every textbook he'd hawked for pocket change, every skipped hot meal had finally paid off in the biggest way possible. He'd fought tooth and nail for that acceptance letter, and he deserved every bit of prestige and security it promised him, but on the other hand, a cold, hollow dread settled deep in my bones. He was bound for a top-tier university 3,000 miles away on the opposite coast, while my own undergraduate transcript was littered mid-tier grades, no national competition awards, zero standout internship credentials to lean on. I hadn't even mustered the courage to submit a single grad school application. Our lives were splitting apart into 2 entirely separate trajectories, a canyon opening between us that neither of us could bridge. That evening, the whole marketing cohort booked a backyard barbecue spot off campus to toast Elias's grad school win. I wandered past the fence lot an hour after the party kicked off, glancing through the chain-link fence to spot him seated at the center picnic table, a half-empty beer glass beside his elbow, surrounded by laughing peers slapping his back and firing off questions about his upcoming move. For a split second, I watched him loosen up, laughing at a joke one classmate cracked, and the sight of that unguarded ease twisted my chest tight. I couldn't bring myself to walk through the gate and join the crowd. It felt like intruding on a world I would never fully belong to. I turned around and hurried back to my dorm, lying to Mia over text that I'd already eaten a late dinner and couldn't make it out. A week later, Kaylee ramped up her campaign to lock Elias down before he left the state entirely. She texted him daily dinner invites, dropped hardcover prep books for his master's coursework on his desk, books he had no use for, already supplied by the university program, and posted candid photos she'd snapped of him at the barbecue to her social media feeds with captions gushing about our star classmate. Every post flooded with dozens of commenters speculating they were secretly dating, and Kaylee let the rumors fester without a single correction. Her advances were loud, public, impossible to ignore, and Elias only responded with polite, consistent distance. He turned down every dinner invite, leave the unopened textbooks untouched on the lecture hall counter, never like or reply to any of her online posts. I watched all of this unfold from the sidelines, quietly cataloging every contrast between her grand, visible gestures and my invisible for years of support. Kaylee wanted the whole campus to see her tied to Elias's rising success. I just wanted him to survive each grueling day without starvation or financial panic. She craved validation from every onlooker. I only cared that he never had to choose between buying textbooks and buying lunch. That gap between our motives widened the chasm I already felt separating me from him, and I made a final, quiet choice that night. Before graduation week wrapped, I would lay every unspoken truth out on paper, hand it to him anonymously, and vanish from his life entirely. No awkward conversations, no painful rejections, no lingering small talk that would make us both uncomfortable once he left for the East Coast. I owed myself closure, even if he never knew the confession came from me. The pale blue journal I'd kept since freshman year sat fully filled by then, every page crammed with tiny, scrawled notes documenting 4 years of hidden care, every meal card deposit amount, every hand warmer I'd slipped in his desk, every quiet heartache watching him struggle, every split second I'd caught myself falling harder for him. I wrote a formal letter on the journal's final blank spread, pen ink smudging repeatedly from the tears dripping down my cheeks mid-write. I laid out every secret plainly. The 4 years of anonymous meal card top-ups, the trips trailing him to the diner, the flea market textbooks I'd bought back for him, the quiet, unrequited love I'd carried since that stairwell collision freshman fall. I stressed none of the money needed repaying, none of the gestures required gratitude. All of it had been fully voluntary, born out of empathy rather than expectation. I told him his future in the East Coast program would be brilliant, that I planned to move back to my small rural hometown after commencement to take a low-level graphic design job at a local print shop, and sign the bottom simply Clara, no last name to give myself away. The night before graduation dawned gray and damp, rain spattering the dorm sidewalks. I grabbed the journal sealed inside a plain brown manila envelope, waited until 3 a.m. when the entire men's dorm was dead silent, and trekked across the wet campus lawn to his building. I found his 4th floor dorm room door, knelt down, and slid the thick envelope clean through the narrow gap beneath the frame, my fingers shaking so bad I nearly dropped it mid-movement. Once the envelope vanished inside his room, I stood motionless on the carpeted hallway floor for 10 long seconds, processing that every secret I'd guarded for 4 years was now in his hands. Then I spun on my heel and ran out of the dorm building as fast as my legs would carry me, like a fugitive fleeing a crime scene I'd just committed. By noon that same day, my phone buzzed with a text message from Elias's contact, a number I'd memorized but never once messaged unprompted. The short line read, "Clara, can we meet somewhere to talk right now?" I stared at those 7 words for 10 full minutes, my chest heaving with panic, then powered my cell phone all the way off and stuffed it deep inside the bottom of my backpack. I couldn't face him. If we met up, he'd ask for explanations, demand to pay me back, force a messy, awkward conversation I wasn't emotionally ready to endure. I couldn't bear watching him pity me after learning everything I'd quietly sacrificed for years. I skipped the mandatory graduation rehearsal that afternoon, packed every single box of my belongings hours ahead of schedule, and signed an early dorm move-out waiver at the housing office. Mia found me hauling my suitcases down the stairwell mid-afternoon, her eyes wide with confusion when I told her I was skipping the actual commencement ceremony entirely to catch an early inner-city bus back to my hometown that evening. She pulled me into a tight, wordless hug, sensing I couldn't articulate the weight pressing down on me, and didn't push me to unpack my reasons. I boarded the bus an hour later without glancing back at the university's stone entrance sign one single time. Over the next 12 years, I erased every trace of Elias Hale from my life completely. I swapped my cell phone number twice, deleted every old class social media group I'd been added to, unfollowed every mutual acquaintance who might post updates about him online, and stored the faded flea market textbooks I'd rescued for him deep in a storage unit hundreds of miles away from my new apartment back home. I dated twice over that decade-long stretch, both relationships collapsing within months for the exact same unspoken reason. Every time a boyfriend reached for my hand or leaned in for a kiss, my brain automatically flashed back to Elias's sharp jaw, his quiet focus mid-lecture, the scar across his left knuckle I'd memorized freshman year. I could never fully open my heart to anyone else. A quiet, unshakable ghost lingered in the back of my mind no matter who I tried to move on with. My career path stagnated slowly, but steadily over those 12 years. I bounced between 3 tiny regional creative agencies, each one underfunded, understaffed, and prone to sudden layoffs or full business collapse. My salary crept up from $3,000 a month to $7,000 a month by the time I relocated to Chicago in late 2025, but big city rent, grocery costs, and medical copays ate every extra dollar I earned without fail. By late autumn 2026, the last design studio I'd worked at folded overnight without severance packages for any staff, leaving me unemployed at 35 with barely $2,800 in total savings tucked into my bank account. I sent out 237 resume applications over 4 straight months, almost all vanishing into recruiters' unread inbox voids. The few interview callbacks always derailed by interviewers fixating on my unmarried status, my advanced age for entry creative roles, and my lack of elite corporate portfolio experience. Then the Summit Media Group Senior Brand Creative Director job posting popped up on my job board feed late one January evening, and I froze solid staring at the CEO name printed at the bottom of the listing, Elias Hale. Summit Media's $2,200 billion market valuation, non-stop national media coverage profiling its young founder, there was no mistaking who it was. I debated closing the tab for hours, wrestling with every old memory resurfacing all at once, before hitting the submit resume button on a reckless, desperate impulse I couldn't rationalize. I needed steady income to avoid eviction, plain and simple, even if walking into that interview meant facing the boy I'd loved and abandoned 12 years prior. 3 brutal screening rounds followed, a 4-hour creative skills written exam, a panel interview with mid-level brand managers, a portfolio presentation walkthrough with the department vice president. I poured every ounce of 12 years of design expertise into each stage, desperate to prove I belonged there purely on merit, not ancient shared college history. The HR coordinator, who called to notify me of final round placement, sounded crisp, formal over the phone line. Congratulations, Clara. Your executive final interview will take place 9 a.m. Monday on the 42nd floor, to be conducted one-on-one exclusively by our CEO, Mr. Elias Hale. The night before the interview, I tossed and turned on my studio's thin mattress until 3 a.m., replaying every worst-case scenario in my head. What if he recognized me instantly and tossed my application aside out of awkward guilt? What if he'd forgotten every detail of our shared college days entirely, leaving me to sit through a grueling blind interview with a stranger who once consumed every thought I had as a teenager? What if he'd long since married someone like Kaylee, wealthy, polished, born into privilege, the exact opposite of me, and saw me as a sad, irrelevant blast from his distant past? Monday morning arrived gray and wind-bitten, like Michigan's frigid gusts whipping around Summit Media's glass skyscraper as I dragged myself through the front lobby doors in a 3-year-old thrifted blazer with frayed sleeve cuffs I trimmed with scissors that morning to hide loose threads. The receptionist directed me to the executive waiting lounge lined with leather armchairs filled with competing final round candidates, all 20-something Ivy League graduates with polished designer blazers and industry trophy portfolios stacked at their knees. I huddled into the furthest corner seat, tucking my beat-up portfolio folder tight against my thighs to shrink into the background as much as possible. A low murmur rippled through the waiting room 10 minutes later as a large entourage of executives and personal assistants filed through the main lobby entrance, clustered around a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tailored charcoal wool suit. My breath caught in my throat the second my eyes locked onto his face. 12 years had softened the gaunt teenage sharpness of his jawline into a firm, mature structure. His shoulders had broadened from years of steady meals and zero backbreaking minimum wage labor, but those same sharp, observant eyes I'd memorized freshman year hadn't changed one bit. He walked straight toward the private executive elevator without glancing at the waiting lounge at first, until his head turned at the very last second before the elevator doors slid shut and his gaze slammed directly into mine. Time stalled for a full 5 seconds. His neutral professional expression flickered, split open with sharp, unmistakable shock before the elevator metal slid between us and cut off all eye contact. My legs turned instantly weak under the weight of that split-second recognition. He'd known who I was immediately after 12 full years apart. A cold panic flooded my bloodstream as I stared at my scuffed leather loafers, replaying every hidden meal card deposit, every tear-stained page of that blue journal, every mile I trailed him to that downtown diner all those years ago. He hadn't forgotten a single thing about me. Minutes later, an HR assistant escorted our group up to the 42nd floor candidate holding room, and I sank into the furthest back row chair to avoid drawing attention. Footsteps echoed down the marble hallway shortly after, Elias emerging from his corner executive office flanked by his chief of staff, going over last-minute meeting logistics in a quiet undertone as he passed each candidate's seat one by one, scanning every unfamiliar face without pause until his line of sight landed on me and froze completely mid-step. The entire hallway fell dead silent. Every other candidate, every assistant, every admin staff member froze to watch the unspoken standoff unfolding between the CEO and the anonymous 35-year-old design applicant tucked in the back corner. Elias's chief of staff hesitated, glancing back and forth between Elias and the rest of the candidate roster, waiting for him to continue the tour as scheduled. Instead, Elias spoke in a low, unshakable tone that carried clear across the quiet corridor. Reschedule every other final interview candidate for later this week. Her slot stays now. I will conduct this interview alone, no observers present. The chief of staff sputtered, attempting to flag the pre-planned rigid HR interview schedule, but Elias cut him off without a single glance away from my rigid, shocked frame. He nodded once in my direction, a quiet command only meant for my ears. Clara, follow me into the main conference room. I stood on shaking knees, my portfolio folder crinkling tight in my white-knuckled grip, and trailed behind him through a set of floor-to-ceiling glass double doors that sealed shut behind us with a soft click once we both stepped inside. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched the full length of the conference room wall, offering an unobstructed panoramic view of Chicago's downtown skyline stretching out for miles beneath gray winter cloud cover. Elias stood with his back to me for a long stretch of quiet minutes, letting the heavy, unspoken tension hang thick in the air before finally rounding the massive polished oak conference table and sliding a leather chair out directly across from my seat. He pulled a familiar object from the locked drawer beneath the tabletop and slid it slowly across the wood surface toward me, stopping at dead center between our 2 chairs. My throat locked shut when I laid eyes on it, that faded pale blue-lined journal I'd stuffed under his dorm door at 3 a.m. The night before graduation, its cover frayed at all 4 corners, the binding worn thin from years of repeated page flipping. The brown manila graduation envelope I'd sealed it inside was long gone, but the journal itself had stayed in his possession every single day for 12 consecutive years. I stared down at the scrawled handwriting covering every page visible on the open spread he'd laid facing upward, the final letter I'd written to him, ink smudged all over the paper from my graduation night tears. Elias's quiet, heavy voice cut through the thick silence of the empty conference room, landing soft but weighted with 12 years of unspoken searching. I've read every single page of this journal, over and over again, for 12 full years straight.